I have a bit of a hot take for you today that feminists really hate, but I think there's some truth and merit to it, and I think it's worth listening to and considering. I think we need to go back to the 1950s, and I'm not talking about the literal years of the 1950s. I'm talking about kind of the nostalgic culture of that period of time, of the post-war period of time, that encompassed both economic boom and as well as defined roles within society and social cohesion that we just don't have today. I think there was something about the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s that worked, and it has since broken down. And I think there's some merit, instead of brushing it under the rug and saying, okay, everyone was oppressed during this period of time. I think there's some merit into looking at the social dynamics of this period of time and why people look on it so nostalgically. So I put this post on Substack, and I asked ChatGPT to render me an image of a family having breakfast, and this is what it came up with. And of course, it's not perfect. Someone in the comments was like, well, how did two adults with black hair have a kid with, orange or, red hair? I don't know. This is ChatGPT, okay? But it personifies like the Norman Rockwell kind of image of the 1950s, where just some key observations, right? Like, everyone was sitting around a table eating a meal together. This was something that was common when I grew up. We always sat down and ate dinner as a family. Yes, there were days where, I had to go from ballet class to basketball practice and things like that. But it was more normal than not normal for all of us to sit down at the table and eat dinner together. So something like this. The food that folks ate in the 1950s, and kind of this broader period of time, wasn't fully adulterated yet. So processed foods were coming into reality. Different companies were manufacturing things. During this time, you saw the rise of fast food and freezer meals and all that kind of stuff. But there was still a normalcy and a culture of cooking food. So you could realistically expect, maybe if your mother had started stepping away from cooking home cooked meals, at least your grandma was still cooking home cooked meals. So you were eating real food. You weren't eating the processed garbage that is available for most Americans today. And then just obviously looking at the way they're dressed. We don't dress like this anymore. And even if you go back and you look at pictures and videos from the early 1900s, people dressed, and they dress nicely. Like and I'm guilty of this too. Like, I'll go to the store in t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops or leggings or whatever. But really, if you look around at culture today, we've just stopped caring. We don't care. I remember when I went to the DMV to get my license when I moved here to Texas, I remember being in there and just everyone looked so like just a bunch of slobs. Like, everyone had Crocs on, and everyone was wearing, pajama pants. There's at least three or four people with pajama pants. People were screaming into their phones, having loud conversations. It was just very uncouth. And I don't know what it was, but when you dress in a way that you take pride in, you're more respectful, right? You're more respectful of the culture around you. If you're gonna go to the store in like your bathrobe, you're not really respectful. So these are just, like, again, some observations of this rendering based on the Norman Rockwell stereotype and in portrayals of that period of time. But just people were more cohesive. There was a family structure. Kids were respectful. Everyone sat at the dinner table. You ate real food, and people dressed nicely. And there was just you had respect. There was a respect and a dignity and a presence that we've just lost. And I think we need to kind of go back and look at what worked in the 1950s and what worked, before then as well. And maybe there's a reason why those things worked, and maybe we should go back. So I think there's three key reasons why we need to go back to the 1950s. The first is we need to go back to a culture of shared stories and shared values. We don't have that anymore. Our culture is split in so many different ways. Immigration and migration is obviously a key fracture point with this, but I look back to even my hometown, right? There was a lot of immigrants who came. There was, Polish neighborhood in town. There was the Italian American society. You had a lot of Irish people. I remember going to parades as a kid, and the Hibernians, the Scottish Hibernians, would come and they would play their bagpipes and wear their kilts. So America was multicultural, but America was first, right? There was this identity of being an American that came first, and then your culture flowed from that. So, a great example, right? You go to Chicago. Chicago is definitely a melting pot of American culture. There's, I visited friends in Portage Park, and there was a store there. I think that's like the Polish area, because there's a store I went to. Everything was in Polish. The radio was in Polish. The newspapers were in Polish. Everyone was speaking Polish. And that's cool, right? I appreciate people preserving their culture and value. But what happens is when that metastasizes and grows on a much broader scale, and instead of being an American, a Polish American, a hyphenated American that expresses Polish identity and preserves your culture, you maintain your Polish identity first, and you expect America to conform with you. So a good example and a good comparison is the Somali community in Minnesota. I was reading recently that, I think it's Minneapolis, where they now have the call to prayer played 5 times a day. The Somali community is a large community in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minnesota has been one to be at the forefront of accepting Somali refugees, right? But that's a pretty big change. And I say that as someone who lived in the Middle East and lived with the 5-time call to prayer day in and day out. You get used to it after a while. But it's not something that's normal in America. And I'm not saying you can't have that per se. But my interpretation of this is that there's an imposition of a foreign culture within Minneapolis. So, it's I guess it's one thing if you live in a country, and if you live in a country where Islam is the dominant religion, and it makes sense to have that, kind of the same way, there's church bells in Europe, right? Like, so it's not too out of the norm. But what it feels like in Minneapolis is you have a community that has effectively colonized Minnesota, and they're now dictating the politics, and they're dictating the culture and the requirements of Minnesota in a way that's not, you're not assimilating into America. You're not becoming part of the American fabric. So the people who've come to the United States from Somalia, they're living in basically enclaves within Minnesota. So they're living in these enclaves. They don't speak English. They're not trying. You have people who've been here for decades, and they're not trying. They're preserving their religion, which is great, but their religion is expanding to the point where maybe it's starting to encroach on everyone else around them and the other communities. Which, okay, I guess if you vote for it and you're a Minnesota resident and you voted for it, okay, that's your choice. But I don't know. Did people vote for it? I don't know. So just things like that. That's a good illustration, right? It's like you can be within a culture and you can celebrate your culture, but you can't get to a point where your culture starts to take over. And we're starting to see this, right? We're starting to see this with illegal migrants because they exist outside of the social fabric of America. They're not here legally. They have to take jobs within a shadow economy. They have to participate in a shadow culture now because of all the efforts to deport them, right? So you're having these shadow cultures emerge. You're having communities who are coming here, and they're fleeing something. So maybe they're fleeing economic issues in their home countries. Maybe they're fleeing gangs, war, violence, famine, whatever. There's all sorts of reasons why people flee their home countries and come here, but they're not immigrating. They're, the migrants coming from Latin America, they're coming to work and they're sending their money back home. They're not building a life here. They're not contributing to the culture here. They're building their own enclaves, again, with the Somali community, right? You have a community that has come here and that has grown and grown and grown. And they're starting to take over parts of Minnesota, and they're not contributing to the social fabric of America. They're not creating anything of value to give back. They're not, it just feels like they're kind of like creating a little Somalia within the United States. And so this is happening at scale, and these communities aren't taking pride in what it means to be an American, And so as they grow, they're challenging what it means to be an American. They're challenging this whole idea of you're a hyphenated American, you assimilate, you're part of this bigger project. So there's that aspect of culture, right? And then there's, I would say, like the more political, urban, rural divide aspect of culture, that just the things people do in the cities, on the coast, is very different than how people behave in rural America and frankly and the rest of the country. And just to give you an example, like I lived in DC for 6 years, and there were the things I did were very feminist in nature. So, going to expensive boutique fitness classes, working really hard at my job, participating in social professional circles, rather than just like social organizations. So you don't have people who are, members of the Moose Club in New York City, right? They're members of private social clubs. I was a member of a private women's only club in DC. You're going to brunch, you're going to happy hour. Like everything in the coast is pay to play, and it's very performative. You're not, people aren't going to brunch because they enjoy spending $30 on avocado toast and coming home hungry. They're going to brunch on the weekends to like play the part and participate in the society that's been constructed around them. So the coast and the urban centers, they develop different cultures than the rest of the country. The rest of the country is more conservative, but it's built around, religion. So church, people go to church. Church is a key part of a lot of small communities. Like I said, there's different organizations like clubs and stuff. So the Moose, the American Legion, the VFW, things like that people go to. They go play bingo and things like that. Families, when you have in the coast, you have a lot of single young people, and they've developed their culture. And in the suburbs and in rural America, you have a lot of families. So culture develops around kids and raising kids, and people join PTO and soccer leagues and all that kind of stuff. So this has existed before. This isn't anything new per se, but I think it's becoming more divisive because it's falling on political fault lines. So people in the cities think people who don't live in cities are backwards and they're heathens and deplorables, as Hillary Clinton famously said. And then the people who live outside of the cities look at what's happening in the cities, and all I see is hedonism and narcissism and selfishness and entitlement. And so the culture that is forming there's expectations about what is normal and what is not. And this shapes perceptions of what you expect. So, people in a city, for example, are accustomed to paying, New York City, for example, they're accustomed to paying exorbitant rents. And so they think, it's become so normalized to them that they're now politically reacting by nominating a socialist who promises to freeze rent in order to bring the housing costs down. Whereas you have, people in rural areas who, they're not accustomed to that. That's not normal. They just want lower, mortgage rates or whatever, but they still want the ability to own a home and protect their home. And so there's political fault lines that are embedded based on the culture that you've normalized. And of course, we're also starting to see a lack of development of new culture within the media, music, movies, all that kind of stuff. So, we were scrolling through Netflix over the weekend, and I was shocked to see Happy Gilmore 2 is on Netflix. And this has been, this isn't unique. This has been happening for a while. There's all these reboots. There's new things. Like when Full House rebooted, that's kind of when I was like, okay, you guys have lost me. There's a reason why things like need to stay in the 90s and the 2000s, right? Like there's a nostalgia. You don't need to remake them, but there's sequels now and Happy Gilmore 2, and there's all these different things, and it just shows music too, right? Like every time I hear a new song on the radio, there's a sample from a previous song, and it's because there's a really good book called Hitmakers by Derek Thompson, and he talks about how music specifically, but there's pattern recognition in it. So a lot of musicians repeat the same like 5 chords or the same beats and the same like format. It's very templated, right? Because there's pattern recognition to it. And so I think what's happening is we've lost our creativity. Like we don't do creative things anymore. Like when's the last time someone produced a movie like Good Will Hunting? or Shawshank Redemption. You know, like the only movies people have talked about this year was the Snow White flop with Rachel Zegler, right? Like we're not who's a great actor, actress who's in their 20s right now, 20s or 30s. Like, can you name a really, like, Leonardo DiCaprio broke out right when he was super young. Do you have like a Leonardo DiCaprio comparison, you know, of someone who's young? I can't think of a single Gen Z like actor or actress, you know. Paintings, right? Like you think of paintings, you know, who do you know? You know, like the Renaissance, the masters from the Renaissance, right? You know, like Van Gogh and Da Vinci and Rembrandt and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Who's a painter today? Does anyone know a famous painter today? Musicians, right? Like, I think a lot of people know Yo-Yo Ma, right? But he's kind of getting old. Who's maybe Lindsay Sterling. You know, she does some cool stuff. But do we have composers? Do we have like anything? There's just, you know, people. I think I listen to a lot of Hans Zimmer. Who's the guy that did Jurassic Park? His name escapes me, but you know, stuff like that, right? Like I think we know stuff like that. But what I'm getting at is we're losing a sense of culture that unifies us. So everyone knows Mozart, right? Like everyone knows like John Steinbeck, everyone knows George Orwell. Like there's common literature, there's common music that we can harken back to, but we're not creating new stuff for like the current age. And so we're just recycling. We're recycling what previously worked, what previously existed. We're not creating anything new. So our culture is being divided. We're being divided along your American status. Are you an American or are you not? Where you live, are you urban, rural, and kind of the politics of that. And then we're just stagnating. We're not creating a new culture. And that's important because culture is how values are distilled to society, stories, right? Throughout millennia, like how have people shared their history, shared what's important, and shared their values through stories. Like storytelling is fundamental to the human experience. And we're not telling stories anymore. And the stories that we are telling, again, are very fragmented, right? You're you know, every time I go on to Netflix, I cringe because if you have 4 characters in a show, one's gay, one's probably questioning their gender, there's a strong feminist, and then there's, you know, a person of color. Like all of these, and that's not necessarily bad. It's not bad to have diversity, but all of these characters feel forced. It feels like you're just checking a box, right? And so the stories aren't developing. There's no stories anymore because you're just creating shows that are vehicles for pushing out specific narratives around diversity and that perception of culture. And so I think we're getting to a point that the glue that's supposed to bind us together, the shared stories and narratives and beliefs and values, just don't exist anymore because there's just so much competition within the cultural marketplace. And I think it's not just men and women who are going their own way. I think a lot of people are just there's fatigue. People are just tired. People are tired of Pride this year. People are just so exhausted. And now, you know, we're just recycling. Like we don't need Happy Gilmore 2. We need something new. So that's the first thing. I think we need to go back to a culture where we have shared stories, shared values. The next thing is we need to go back to an economy where businesses were headquartered in communities and they were accountable to the people who live there. So before, you know, the 1970s, so between the post-war period and like the 1970s, we had a very strong national economy. And of course, this was because we were in part subsidizing the rebuilding of the world. We were, you know, helping Japan rebuild. We were helping Western Europe rebuild. There was pent-up demand, obviously, for stuff to be manufactured because during the Great Depression and then the war that followed, you know, there was a lot of pullback in the economy. People weren't spending as much. So the 50s was kind of like a bursting at the seams of all this pent-up demand and then newfound peace in society, so people could do things that maybe they didn't feel like they could do before. But the businesses that existed during this time were fundamentally different than the ones we're accustomed to today. A lot of small mom and pop businesses were created during this period of time, and they actually they weren't just providing a service, right? They were serving the communities they lived in, and they felt like a sense of duty and responsibility. So I was reading Janesville, which is about the GM plant closure in Ohio. And one of the things they talk about in the book is the Parker Pen Company, which I had not heard about. But the Parker Pen Company was started in Wisconsin. And it says by 1900, the guy who founded it, his business had large contracts to sell pens to the federal government and a Main Street address for its 4-story factory and sales office before it eventually moved into a handsome steel frame factory along Court Street. As his business grew, so did a paternalistic generosity that Parker showered on his workers, typical of the welfare capitalism of the day, intended to foster loyalty and ward off unrest. So there's, of course, a lot of dynamics to this and why businesses develop this way. But it gets to a point where if you had an idea for a business, like you founded a business, it was usually your name. So Parker Pen Company was named after George Parker, I think it is. So families started businesses. They had Main Street addresses, so they were on Main Street. The factories were in smaller buildings on Main Street, and eventually you grew and you built, and you built a factory in a different part of town maybe. But you were a presence in that community. You were physically there. So one of the people in this book, her name is Linda. It talks about how she started working at Parker Pen Company, I think in the 60s when she graduated high school. And it was a big honor. Like the HR people would come and they would choose typically girls. So girls did work. Shocker to the feminists. But the girls did work, and it was pride. It was a point of pride to be hired at Parker. And so the book tells the story of Linda, who started out as Parker. Parker got acquired by some like national company. And then eventually it just became a shell company for creating promotional products. So if you've ever gotten, went to an event and you got a pen, it went from a company that manufactured high quality pens here in the United States and employed a bunch of people to a company that just like screen printed logos onto cheap Chinese made pens. But one of the things that, it talks about, so after the company was, here, let me read this. So the company was acquired. They have no longer been making pens. They have been printing the logos of pharmaceutical companies and other businesses onto the sides of pens that were made overseas. So when the British Parker Pen and then Gillette and then finally Newell Rubbermaid Sanford B2B, so those are all the different companies that acquired Parker Pen throughout the years. More than a name was surrendered. Gone too is a relationship that workers had with a local family-run business, and that the family that owned the business and had with the community in which the workers lived. So it wasn't just that these companies, it wasn't just like today companies are kind of parasitic in a lot of ways. They like aggregate capital, they move it overseas, offshoring of work overseas to generate higher profits, that kind of stuff. It wasn't like that. You had a business that was in the community, and the family that owned the business and ran the business also was in the community. So you could be the neighbor, like someone who worked at the Parker Pen Company. Okay, maybe not. They probably wouldn't be the neighbor of the founder, but of a higher up, or maybe the chief executive or whatever. They would be neighbors with those people. So there was homogeneity within the society. Everyone was mixed together. Socioeconomic classes were mixed together. And these types of businesses were really important because they provided the things that women are demanding now. So Linda talks in here, and Parker sent women home to when they were pregnant and hired them back once their babies were a year old. Every day, break time began with the arrival of a woman who wheeled a coffee cart through the factory with fresh, hard rolls and squares of cheese and sometimes even baked apples and donuts. Managers understood if a worker had to stay home with a sick child, right? So these are just a couple fragments of the narrative here, but you kind of get the point. Like, we live in a world today where Amazon drivers are so busy they're peeing in water bottles because they have to hit their targets. And we used to live in a world where women worked and women were sought after. Companies were headquartered in communities. The families and everyone and the workers and all different types of the hierarchy within that company all intermingled with each other. They all sent their kids to the same schools. You had a culture where, there was a coffee cart that went around the factory and people, could buy fresh rolls and things, not the garbage we're eating today. Think about the hospital workers that just eat vending machine food and, garbage all the time. Like we used to have better quality of work than that. And then, if you got pregnant, you weren't going to lose your career. And then if you had to go home because your kid was sick, it was expected you would do that. So we lived in a culture where the businesses were accountable to the people, and you had the infrastructure needed to support families. And we don't have that today. We traded that. We instead have all these massive multinational ginormous corporations who produce overseas. They don't care. They clearly don't care. Americans have been subsidizing overseas slave labor for decades, and we're okay with that. And that just, it's gross. It's gross. We've lost pride in things that were made in America by Americans, because it's quote unquote too expensive. And really it's not. We've gotten lazy and accepted this, normalization. But, the largest employers and the private employers in the country right now are Walmart and Amazon. And they have notorious reputations for not paying their workers well, Walmart in particular. And so we've normalized this, we've accepted this, and we've allowed businesses to degrade our communities. And and I say we allow this because, there's, of course, powers that be in Washington and tax incentives and all that good stuff that enables companies to skirt the law, to, offshore and take jobs with them, to move their profits overseas as well so they can avoid taxes. Like, there's all sorts of structural problems. I get that. But we vote with our wallets. We are the consumers that is keeping this engine going. So long as we continue shopping at Walmart, we're voting in favor of how Walmart conducts its business. So if we want a better quality of life, we need to vote with our wallets to make that quality of life happen. And that quality of life comes down to companies that are within the communities that they are employing people in, that they are present in. They're giving back through philanthropy. They're creating, all sorts of different, example, right? So there was a pathway from high school to working at the Parker Bank Company. There was an employment pathway, right? That was provided by a company. You don't need the government to step in. We need individuals within communities to take pride in their country, take pride in their communities, and then foster economic development within those communities. We don't need more digital apps to do things. We need more people to participate in their local economy, and their local government too, for that matter. Not even just economy, local government. We need more people to participate in their communities, and we've lost that. The third thing that I want to touch on is I think we need to go back to Sunday suppers. Like, we had a culture in the 50s, and again, this is broadly speaking, but we had a culture where it was custom, like after church, you'd go home and you'd have a big Sunday supper, and all the family would come over. And then throughout the week, you stay-at-home moms, that was a thing, and they would visit with one another. Like, you didn't necessarily, like, you knew your neighbors. You would go over, hang out, have coffee. And we don't do that anymore. Every single social interaction we have today is predicated on spending money. If I want to go have a coffee date or a networking date with someone, I need to go to a coffee shop, right? And then you need to schedule an appointment. Like, I was using this for a while, Calendly. I've stopped doing coffee meetings, by the way. I think they're a total waste of time. But you use Calendly, for example, to schedule a time, and then you go and you meet people for coffee, and there's no real social interaction anymore, especially during the work week. It's all business. And then I rarely see people just having social interactions. Like, you go to a coffee shop, it's either people working, it's people, again, networking, business. I've seen people do Bible studies, which I think is kind of cool. People doing homework together, but there's no, we don't social visit with one another. We don't go to everyone's, other people's homes. We don't share experiences. We don't talk to our neighbors. And I think we need to go back to that. We need to stop deferring participation in society to businesses that just want to extract money from us. And like I was saying before, a lot of these are big multinational companies. They're private equity firms. Like, you go to Olive Garden and you're not supporting your local community. You're supporting Darden Restaurant Group and its shareholders, right? And okay, sure, you're supporting, the waitress that works there, but that's about it. There's no shared, again, the values aren't there. We're not supporting the shared economy. And then we're putting pressure on one another to go spend money to go on these social excursions that aren't even worth it anymore. Like, the quality of restaurant service has gone down. Most places are just deplorable. And if you do go to one of those chain restaurants, they're basically glorified microwaves. They're taking frozen food and heating it up and putting it on a plate and serving it to you. And you go to small plate places and same side of, different side of the same coin. It's just low quality, minuscule portions that leaves you hungry at the end. So I don't even know what we're going out for. People go out to drink and they think that that's fun. I never was into drinking culture. I cannot understand for the life of me going to a bar to become mentally incapacitated and spending hundreds of dollars along the way and possibly putting yourself in all sorts of different risky situations. How that is fun and that is like socially acceptable is beyond me. But I think we need to go back to like at home social visits. Like, why can't we just like make a pot of coffee and invite your girlfriends over and hang out? And okay, say you live in an apartment complex. I lived in one too. Like, there was all these community areas that no one ever used. There's, spaces where even if you don't feel comfortable hosting someone inside your home, there's spaces where you like sit outside, go to a park. I don't know, but we don't have to, like, not every interaction needs to be commercial and commercialized. And again, we've let corporations dictate our culture and our society and our values. And it's been divisive, right? It's dividing us. And now every sort of social interaction is predicated on money. Gen Z doesn't have any money, so they're opting for isolation. And so I think we need to go back to the 50s. Everyone talks about like we need to be ashamed of it. Like it's a regression, like it's a reversion, but maybe it worked. Like maybe there's something to it, right? Like women work from home, but women were the bedrock of community, right? They were the ones that cooked the Sunday suppers, that brought families together. They're the ones that paid social visits and, made it so that kids could interact and have friendships with one another across socioeconomic lines. They're the ones who helped shaped, the culture that kids participated in. And, women played such a fundamental role, and we've lost that. And so I think that's what we need to go back to. We need to go back to a time where we had those shared values and we had a mechanism for transferring those values to the next generation. And we've completely lost that. And I think partly to blame is feminism and women going to the workforce. Women don't cook anymore. They're too busy. They're too tired. They don't know how. Some just don't even know how. They're obviously, many aren't raising kids because they see kids as a burden. They see family as a sacrifice. They don't want to sacrifice their career too. And so I think we need to stop looking at the 50s as this like evil, awful period of time and start looking at the merits of it. What worked? Why did it work? And maybe we need to start bringing it back because I think the more divided we become, the harder it's going to be to maintain a cohesive United States of America, to be totally honest with you. I don't know for how much longer, like, we're going to be able to maintain a society dictated by different values. I mean, just look at the recent riots in Los Angeles. Like, that's not, people waving Mexican flags, fighting law enforcement. That's not America. That's not my country. I don't know, like, and obviously I don't live there. I didn't vote for that, but that's like a different representation of the version of America that I live in, and maybe the version of America you live in. So we have all these different versions that are competing with one another. And when we don't have a shared set of values, we don't have a shared identity, we don't all believe in the same American project, how on earth is this country going to continue to exist? It's an important question to consider. And then, of course, young people aren't having kids. So the ones who are going to win the future are going to be the ones who are having kids today. And whatever culture they decide is going to be the culture of tomorrow. So if you have a lot of religious conservatives having large families today, they're the ones that are going to dominate the future. So I think this is worth, really thinking about, like, what are we doing here? And why are we letting, again, big companies and all these, social media platforms, and why are we letting all of this dictate our lives? We have communities, we can invest in them, we're choosing not to. I think it's not even just America first at this point. It's like, yeah, be an American. Like, that should be your primary identity. But it's invest in your local community, invest in your local government, invest in relationships with people who are proximate to you. I think that's something we need to go back to. And that's the biggest lesson we can learn from the 1950s. That's all I got for you today. If you enjoyed this video, I would like if you would subscribe and follow along and share this with anyone who you might think would find interest in this. I think this whole perversion of the past, we keep rewriting history to pervert the past and make it seem like it's this bad evil thing. And I think there's nuggets of wisdom we can derive from the past, and we really ought to look at what worked and use that as a lesson to pave the way as we move forward. All right, I'll see you in the next video.